Hello, and welcome to Gothic Reviews. Today we are reviewing a vampire novel, Carmilla, by Joseph Sheridan Le Fanu, who was one time an editor of Bram Stoker's Dracula, but was also popular for his own ghost stories. This novel was published in 1872, many years before Dracula itself, around 26 or something. So, what did you think about the novel?
Well, first of all, we read it on audio, so we don't have the actual book to show. That rhymed. Oh, goodness. But we showed like a little caption from it in our thumbnail. So it's an interesting book. It came out, I think Dracula came out in 1897, and Bram Stoker was supposed to have been greatly influenced by Carmilla. And you can see that especially in the ending and some of the other vampire traits, although some of them are different. Some of the things that vampires can do and different myths are definitely different in Carmilla, so it's worth a read if you're into vampires. I think it was an interesting book. It was a little slow, but I think a lot of them were from that time period. It's just kind of fun to read a part of history and enjoy the style that was going on back then in the Gothic novels. And I think that it's slow to our minds because we already know so much about vampires and the paranormal and the supernatural in this age that it's not a big new thing for us or an unraveling mystery. But back then, there were only 2 other vampire stories published before this that were widely spread. So, back then it was a new thing, so it was probably okay that it unfolded slowly and had all this going on. So it was new, and it's just a different perspective. But the book, this is going to be some spoilers. The book starts with a little doctor's report. Back in that day and age, a lot of the paranormal, which I like, has the style of written letters from a person documenting. So you're like, oh, this could be real. This could have been their letters that they kept and documented. And I think that was the point, to make it feel more realistic. Frankenstein's that way, Dracula's that way, Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde is that way. It's written in that spirit or mindset, and so is this. And it's told from the story perspective of one of the girls that this vampire Carmilla is kind of courting almost. She's like a friend, but it has a lot of almost lesbian like innuendos in there, and I think it's supposed to be like some kind of vampire sensuality, but it's woman to woman. And back then that was pretty scandalous, and the girl that was being approached didn't really seem that interested. She kind of seemed freaked out by it, even though she liked Carmilla as a friend. But, that was a pretty sensual kind of thing for going on back then. They mentioned the sensuality in Dracula a lot, but I saw a lot more of it in the precursor to Dracula in Carmilla. So, yeah, that was kind of interesting. I was like, whoa, that's pretty hardcore for back then. Like, definite lesbian innuendo going on. At least on Carmilla's part herself, who is the vampire. And it's kind of interesting. I thought she was the vampire, but then I wasn't sure a little bit, because she can go out in the day, it seems, and she can, I think, eat and everything, because they didn't comment how she wasn't eating. And there were some other things that we don't want to ruin the whole thing, but it just seemed like different abilities, and a lot of that where vampires can do more normal things I thought was more of a modern edition, where people just didn't want to deal with the restrictions. But this is old school, and it seemed to be kind of similar, so that was really interesting. So it's from this girl's perspective, and it ends up unfolding where they realize that Carmilla is the one who is the culprit here, because the girl is, like in Dracula with Lucy or Mina, getting weaker and weaker as she is fed on, and she's getting sick, and they don't know what's wrong with her. And that's kind of where Stoker took the same thing with the girl being fed from and having more and more health issues and whatnot, staying abed and feeling faint and everything. In Carmilla, there were more disturbing dreams as a vampire feeding side effect, I think, than there was in Bram Stoker's Dracula. So that was kind of interesting, because we enjoy dreams. So that was, it was kind of eerie. It had a good eerie feel. It's a good Gothic novel. But in the end, she is talking with her father and another family friend about another girl who recently had the same experience with this Carmilla person, except that her name was spelled in a different order, but they figured it out, and the girl died. It was the general's father. General was a friend of theirs. So daughter. I haven't had enough coffee. It was the general's daughter, adopted daughter kind of thing, ward, that he thought of as a daughter, and she perished. I don't know though. It was kind of like they mentioned how if these people die at the vampire's hands, they turn into vampires, but we didn't hear about the general's daughter coming back as a vampire, so maybe she did and she just didn't go back to see her dad, or I was kind of wondering about that, and it didn't say. There's a few things I was wondering about. Some vampires were mentioned with Carmilla, and I guess they just kind of faded away too after she got killed. She got killed much in the way that Dracula gets killed, but we're trying to give spoilers where you get an idea of the book but not spell it all out, so I don't know how good of a job we're doing, or I'm doing, since I'm doing this part right now. But I'm not going to go into all of it, but it's definitely, you can see where Bram Stoker was inspired. And I have a problem with the way Dracula was killed, because I think it makes no sense that this great, powerful vampire king who could control animals and whatnot during the daytime with his mind, and people during the daytime with his mind, just gets staked in the heart by some human right before sundown. Like, it just kind of has flaws for me, but it's all good. But I would say the same with Carmilla there. She didn't really seem to be attached to her grave until the very end. That was kind of interesting for me, like how she had to go to her grave, and then once they found out who she was just still in her grave to be found. Maybe she thought they wouldn't know where her grave was, or who she really, really was, even though they knew that she was Carmilla. Maybe she didn't think they figured out like her real name and her real past, which we won't ruin right now. But I was just like wondering, why is she just waiting in the grave? Like, doesn't she think she might not want to go there?
Kind of reminded me of that theme of ghostly possession, where sometimes to get rid of a ghost, you have to burn an object they're attached to get rid of them. And with the idea that the writer of this story was himself usually a ghost writer, it kind of makes sense to me that maybe he tried to connect it to this ghost, where the vampire seems to be connected in the way that ghosts act in some ways.
Yes, and she didn't seem to have all the vampire restrictions. She could be solidly touched and whatnot, but there are some other things that you will understand if you end up reading it, what Gomez means about the ghost connection. But I see what you mean. And
yes.
I think it's an interesting Gothic novel. I'm definitely glad we read it. And for vampire fans and people who enjoy like the Victorian period, I would definitely consider it worth a read if you have not already read it.
So we already mentioned the cons as far as the slow movement of the plot and stuff, but as far as
Hey, I mentioned some pros.
Yes,
Okay.
but I'm just going to mention my own.
Okay.
Some of the pros that I noticed were interesting elements of Victorian culture. For example, even that spelling of the name, the anagrams, they were parlor games, of course, at Victorian times. So it is like very, very Victorian, and that's part of the way we get the atmosphere, the Victorian atmosphere from this story, not just the writing itself, but also all the environment, including the anagram games, including masquerades, including other certain things that are very typical for Victorian and harder to see in our time. And also I liked very vivid descriptions, even when a family is in ruins and you see the castle, and I can easily imagine myself being in that castle. I can imagine the river and the bridge they're describing. I can imagine their gargoyles described. It's like very properly Gothic, and I can imagine it all, and not every writer of this age or any other can do it so well.
And I would like to add, he is correct on that, but it was very well described, very vividly described, as you said.
Yeah.
But it wasn't rambling on and on and on forever. Like sometimes a lot of authors today, or even back when, would describe it really vividly to the point that you're going out of your skull with boredom. And it's mind-numbing. And you can zone out through 5 pages and really you didn't miss much, because they're still going on about the arches and the stonework and the gargoyles, which is great. It's just, a little bit goes a long way, and too much is too much. So I feel that this author did a great job of making it where we could picture it vividly, feel like we were there, but he didn't have the character go on and on and on. And the character didn't ramble too much. Like, she did narrate well the story, and when I say it took a while to get into, but she wasn't like dithering. She was still moving from thing to thing. and event to event. So she was a good character narrator, and I think that the detail was just enough, but not enough to get you going, okay, are we going to move on to something else now?
Yeah, that was nice that despite the vividness, the story was actually pretty short, especially based on our modern standards of
I think
a
like
novel.
16 chapters.
Yeah, it seems like a very smallish book. And the other part that I liked about it was, as far as the atmosphere goes, how it represented accurately that atmosphere of vampire trials. It used to be big things throughout Europe, of course, we all know, but in particular the area where it concentrates used to belong to the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and they had very publicized trials. They had special experts come in to deal with vampires in those days. They were commissioned by the crown itself, and it seems almost like, well, Stoker himself used it as his inspiration, but Le Fanu also used it, and it gives some kind of a realistic tone the way we have the narrative. It almost reminds me of one of those court transcripts being official documentation of what was happening, the way they believed it. So it's like a very nice touch. So I liked several elements of that Victorian reminiscent type of thing that other vampire writers used for inspiration. And some of the names I noticed, and you probably will too once you research it, how some of the names, they recur, of course, in some version in Dracula as well, but I also mean that some of them belong to historical figures. If you look up, for example, for those who gave patronage to Mozart and Beethoven in Vienna and stuff, you would find those vampire hunters at the highest echelons of the empire, and their names would remind you of the names we see as characters in Carmilla too, at least their last names, not specifically their first names. They were pretty big dynasty.
It's a very nice connection for those in the know on that historical point.
Yeah, so there are very, very many elements that we could cover here, so it was a very nice novel. And what else? Do we have anything else to add?
I suppose...
Maybe the names, like since I'm always fascinated by names, like certain if you think of different names that you see in all kinds of other Victorian novels or movies, you might recognize the name Renfield in a different context, or the name Frankenstein slightly.
He's not saying the name Renfield is used. It's like Ren.
Yeah, it's more else. Like Reinfeld, I guess.
Yeah, something that's similar, and it was something else Stein, but it made me
Karstein.
Yeah, Karstein. It made me think of Frankenstein. And yes, it's a big difference, but it's like a little similarity that makes you think about it because of all the different literature going on back then. So it was kind of like a nod to the other stuff, except that Renfield actually came later. So maybe again, Stoker was nodding to him, which he said he was heavily influenced by that story. So
that was Joseph Sheridan Le Fanu, the third vampire writer of the Victorian period, the other two being a story in Penny Dreadful, Varney the Vampire, and by Dr. Polidori, The Vampire with a Y, based on Lord Byron, and then Sheridan Le Fanu that we covered here was the third after them, about 20 years maybe after the one before it in Penny Dreadful. So it definitely represents the times, it has the atmosphere, it is properly gothic, and we would recommend it for a read. And we are Bedweb Gothic Reviews.